40 years of broadcasting, and never a moment like this. Steve Harvey had seen it all. The tears of joy when families won cars they desperately needed, the laughter that echoed through sound stages at 3 in the morning, the arguments over answers so ridiculous they became legendary. He had perfected the double take, mastered the art of the long pause, learned exactly when to let silence do the talking. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon in late September, beneath the hot lights of Stage 43, something happened that would strip away every layer of showmanship he had ever built and leave only the man underneath. The studio audience had no idea. They were settling into their seats with popcorn and anticipation, phones tucked away per protocol, ready for another taping of Family Feud. Two families stood on either side of the podium, both smiling, both nervous, both believing this would be just another game. The Coopers on the left, a family of 5 from Denver, Colorado. The Mitchells on the right, restaurant owners from Birmingham, Alabama. Standard setup, standard energy. The kind of wholesome American entertainment that had been Steve's bread and butter for decades. But if you had been watching closely, if you had studied the Cooper family in those moments before the cameras started rolling, you might have noticed something different. The way they stood closer together than most families do. The way the father's hand rested protectively on his teenage daughter's shoulder. The way the mother kept glancing at that same girl, with a mixture of pride and concern so fierce it could have moved mountains. The way the two younger brothers flanked their sister like sentries, their usual teenage restlessness replaced by something deeper, something that looked like devotion. Her name was Michaela, 16 years old. Dark curls pulled back in a ponytail, eyes that held stories she was too young to carry, and hands that moved in a language most of the audience wouldn't understand. The warm-up comedian was finishing his routine. The director was counting down. Steve Harvey was adjusting his tie, getting into character, preparing to be the man America expected him to be: funny, warm, larger than life. He didn't know yet. None of them did. They couldn't have imagined that in less than 20 minutes, the game would stop mattering entirely. That survey answers and points would become meaningless. That the cameras would keep rolling, but the show would become something else entirely. Something raw and real, and so profoundly human that viewers would watch it again and again, not for entertainment, but for proof that grace still exists in unexpected places. The stage manager called for quiet. The lights brightened. Steve Harvey walked to his mark with that characteristic swagger, his smile easy and confident. He had done this thousands of times. He knew every beat, every joke, every way to stretch a moment for maximum impact. He thought he was ready for anything. But you can't prepare for the moment when a girl who hasn't spoken in 2 years decides that now, right now, in front of 300 strangers and millions of viewers is the time to try. You can't rehearse your reaction when courage looks you in the eye and asks you to witness it. You can't plan for the instant when television stops being television and becomes a chapel, sacred and still. The red light on the camera blinked on. Steve Harvey opened his mouth to deliver his opening line. And somewhere in the cosmos, the universe took a breath and whispered, "Pay attention. What's about to happen matters more than you know." Because sometimes a game show becomes a testimony. Sometimes entertainment transforms into ministry. And sometimes, just sometimes, the silence before someone speaks can teach you more about love than 1,000 words ever could. This is that story. 2 years earlier, Michaela Cooper had been a 14-year-old girl whose voice filled every room she entered. She sang in the shower. She debated politics with her father over breakfast. She called her friends at midnight to discuss nothing and everything. She had opinions about music, fashion, climate change, and why pineapple absolutely did not belong on pizza. Her voice was her instrument, her weapon, her gift. Until one rainy November evening, when a distracted driver ran a red light at the intersection of Colfax and Spear, and everything changed in the time it takes a heart to beat. The doctors at Denver Health Medical Center delivered the news with clinical precision. Severe head trauma, damage to the temporal lobe, bilateral sensory neural hearing loss, permanent. The word hung in the hospital room like smoke, suffocating every hope that this might be temporary. That morning would bring restoration, that prayer could reverse physics. Michaela woke up 3 days later to a world without sound. No beeping monitors, no whispered conversations in the hallway. No voice telling her everything would be okay, because she couldn't hear those words even when her mother said them over and over, tears streaming down her face, lips forming promises that disappeared into the void. What happened next was not heroic in the way movies make heroism look. There were no swelling orchestras or inspiring montages. There was grief. There was anger. There was a 16-year-old girl who stopped trying to speak because what was the point of words you couldn't hear yourself say? Who spent months in a silence so complete it felt like drowning? Who looked at her family and saw their mouths moving, and felt more alone than she had ever imagined possible? But the Coopers did something that not every family does. They didn't just support Michaela, they entered her world entirely. David Cooper, the father, a construction foreman whose hands were more accustomed to holding hammers than forming delicate shapes in the air, enrolled in ASL classes at the community college. He practiced in his truck during lunch breaks, fingers fumbling through the alphabet, determined to tell his daughter he loved her in a language she could understand. Jennifer Cooper, the mother, turned their kitchen into a classroom, labeling everything in English and fingerspelling, creating a home that spoke in gestures and expressions. The younger brothers, 12-year-old twins named Marcus and Ethan, competed to see who could learn signs faster, turning tragedy into a kind of game. Because that's what children do when they need to survive something unbearable. Within 6 months, the entire Cooper household was fluent. They signed at the dinner table, in the car, during movies, in their sleep. They became bilingual not because they had to, but because that's what love looks like when it has no other choice. And slowly, gradually, Michaela began to return. Not to who she was, that girl was gone, but to who she was becoming. A girl who could smile again, who could argue with her brothers in ASL, her hands flying faster than their mouths ever could, who started to see her silence not as a prison, but as a different kind of poetry. But there was something the family didn't know, something Michaela hadn't told them, because the vulnerability felt too immense, the potential for failure too crushing. 6 months earlier, Michaela's audiologist had suggested something unexpected. Recent advances in speech therapy, combined with Michaela's retained muscle memory and her relatively late onset of deafness, meant that she might be able to speak again. Not to hear that gift was gone, but to form words, to shape sound, to use her voice even without the feedback of hearing it. It would be difficult. It would take months of intensive work, and there was no guarantee it would work. Michaela had been working with a speech therapist named Dr. Sarah Kim 3 times a week for half a year, learning to feel vibrations in her throat, to remember how breath became language, to trust that the sounds forming in her mouth were real even though she couldn't verify them. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than surviving the accident, harder than learning to navigate a silent world, harder than watching her parents cry when they thought she wasn't looking. She hadn't spoken aloud in front of her family, hadn't told them what she was attempting. Because what if she failed? What if her voice came out wrong, broken, unrecognizable? What if trying and failing was worse than never trying at all? So when the producers of Family Feud reached out part of their Hometown Heroes series, celebrating families who exemplified resilience, the Coopers saw it as an adventure. A chance to show the world that disability doesn't mean inability, that family means showing up, that love speaks in more languages than most people realize. They packed their bags for Los Angeles with excitement. They practiced potential answers. They laughed about what Steve Harvey might say when he saw a family communicating entirely in sign language. They never imagined that before the day was over, the world would hear something that only Dr. Kim had heard in 2 years. Michaela's voice. The game began the way all games begin, with noise, with energy, with Steve Harvey doing what Steve Harvey does best, commanding a room with nothing but presence and a perfectly timed eyebrow raise. All right, all right, all right. His voice boomed across the studio. We got the Cooper family from Denver, Colorado. The audience applauded on cue. And we got the Mitchell family from Birmingham, Alabama. More applause, more energy. The kind of manufactured enthusiasm that feels real because, for a moment, it is. Steve moved to the Coopers, microphone in hand, ready to do the pre-game banter that would later be edited into a tight 90 seconds. He started with David, the father, asking the standard questions about work, hobbies, why they decided to audition. David answered with the kind of nervous authenticity that makes good television genuine, warm, slightly awkward. Then Steve moved down the line. Jennifer, the mother, the twins, Marcus and Ethan, who couldn't stop grinning, and finally, Michaela. She stood there, hands folded in front of her, eyes meeting Steve's with a steadiness that made him pause. Most teenagers looked away. Most people did. But Michaela held his gaze like she had nothing to hide and everything to say. "And what's your name, sweetheart?" Steve asked. Michaela didn't respond. Her hands began to move, fluid and purposeful, signing her name. But Steve couldn't understand, and for a moment, the timing faltered. David stepped forward, his voice gentle. "This is Michaela, Steve. She's 16. She's deaf." The word landed differently than David intended. Not as explanation, but as revelation. Steve Harvey, who had interviewed thousands of people, who prided himself on reading a room, felt something shift in his chest. He looked at Michaela again, really looked, and saw what he had missed before, the way her eyes tracked lips instead of sounds, the way her family stood closer, protective, not possessive, the way her hands had been speaking all along, and he had been too loud to notice. "Deaf," Steve repeated softly. Then, louder, to the producers, to the audience, to anyone listening, "Can we get an interpreter up here?" A woman emerged from backstage, part of the production team they'd brought on specifically for this family. She positioned herself next to Michaela, and suddenly there were 3 languages happening at once. Steve's words, the interpreter's signs, Michaela's responses translated back into sound. It should have felt clunky. It should have slowed everything down. Instead, it felt like watching a dance. Through the interpreter, the story emerged. The accident, the silence, the family learning ASL together. Steve Harvey, who thought he had heard every story, found himself standing very still, his microphone lowering unconsciously, his showman's mask slipping away to reveal something more human underneath. "So your whole family learned to sign?" he asked, his voice different now, softer, stripped of performance. "We all did," Jennifer said, her hands moving in sync with her words. "Because she's worth it." Marcus jumped in, his 12-year-old enthusiasm uncontainable. "We're actually better at signing than talking now. Sometimes we forget and sign at the grocery store and people look at us weird." The audience laughed. But it was different laughter. Tender. Aware that they were witnessing something beyond entertainment. Steve turned back to Michaela. "You know what? I think you're pretty amazing." Through the interpreter, Michaela signed back. "Thank you. You're pretty loud." The audience erupted. Steve threw his head back and laughed, genuine, surprised, delighted. "Oh, we got a comedian. I like this girl." And then, because the show must go on, because there was still a game to play, Steve moved them to the podium. The first round went smoothly. The Coopers were good, their answers solid, their teamwork evident. When it was the twins' turn, they practically sprinted to the buzzer. When it was Jennifer's turn, she was thoughtful and strategic. When it was David's turn, his construction worker pragmatism served them well. The score was tied when Steve called Michaela to the podium for the final face-off round. She walked forward, her steps measured, her expression calm. The interpreter positioned herself nearby. The studio, which had been buzzing with energy, seemed to sense that something was different about this moment. A hush fell, the kind that happens before something breaks or before something begins. Steve looked at Michaela across the podium. "You ready?" She nodded. "All right then." Steve glanced at his card. "Here we go. We surveyed 100 people. Top 7 answers on the board." He paused for effect, his timing impeccable as always. "Name something people say they'll do tomorrow but never actually do." It was a perfect setup for a funny answer. Diet, exercise, laundry. The kind of relatable, light-hearted question that made for good television. Steve hit the podium. The buzzer sounded. Michaela's hand slapped down first. She won the face-off, which meant she had to answer. The interpreter began to sign the question to Michaela, but something strange happened. Michaela held up her hand, a universal gesture that transcended language. "Wait." She took a breath, the kind that looks like someone preparing to jump from a very high place. Her family, watching from the side, suddenly tensed. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. David took a step forward, then stopped, frozen between protection and permission. Because they had seen that look before. In Dr. Sarah Kim's office, Michaela had practiced this 1,000 times. Sitting in a soundproof room with her hand on her throat, feeling the vibrations, trusting the science that said muscle memory and breath control could create speech even without auditory feedback. She had spoken sentences, struggled through words, felt her therapist's encouraging smile even when the sounds came out wrong. But that was in private. That was in safety. That was in a space where failure was just data, just another step in the process. This was different. This was 300 strangers watching. This was cameras recording for millions. This was her family, her beautiful, sacrificial, signing family who had learned an entire language to meet her in her silence. How could she tell them she had been working towards sound again? How could she explain that speaking didn't mean leaving them behind, that finding her voice wasn't rejection of the world they had built together? But standing at that podium, with Steve Harvey's kind eyes watching her, and the studio lights hot on her skin, and her mother's barely suppressed sob echoing in a silence only she couldn't hear, Michaela made a decision that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with courage. She opened her mouth. What happened next would be analyzed frame by viewers around the world. Therapists would use it in training videos. Disability advocates would cite it in speeches. But in the moment, it was simply a girl trying to do the hardest thing she had ever done. The first sound was barely audible, a breath, an intention. Her vocal cords, unused to the work, struggled to find the shape. But then, soft, uncertain, fragile as new glass came a word. Start. It didn't sound like it used to. Her voice was different, lower, unsure, the consonants imperfect. But it was there, real, present. Her hand pressed against her throat, feeling the vibrations that confirmed what she couldn't hear. She was making sound. Steve Harvey, who had been ready with a joke, who had his timing planned out, who knew exactly what he was supposed to do next, froze completely. His mouth actually fell open. The microphone in his hand dropped to his side. For the first time in 40 years of television, Steve Harvey had no words. The studio audience heard it before they understood it. A few people gasped. Others looked confused, glancing at their neighbors as if to confirm what they thought they'd heard. But Jennifer Cooper, mother, warrior, guardian, understood immediately. Her legs buckled. David caught her, his own face crumbling, his construction-hardened hands shaking as he held his wife upright. The twins stood frozen, their mouths open in mirror images of shock. Michaela's interpreter, Linda, who had been ready to translate, lowered her hands slowly, tears streaming down her face because she understood the magnitude of what she was witnessing. She had interpreted for dozens of deaf clients. She had seen struggles and triumphs. But she had never seen this, a girl reclaiming sound on live television, in front of the people who loved her most, with courage that seemed too large for her teenage frame. "Wait," Steve finally managed, his voice hoarse. He held up both hands, and even though Michaela couldn't hear him, the gesture was universal. "Stop! Everyone stop!" He turned to the control booth, to the producers, to whoever was listening. "Hold up. Cut the clock. Stop everything." The game clock froze at 17 seconds. The audience, sensing something seismic, went completely silent. 300 people held their breath as one organism, unified by the awareness that they were witnessing something beyond entertainment, beyond television, beyond anything they had come here expecting. Steve walked around the podium. Protocol said, "Stay at your mark." Television said, "Maintain the format." But Steve Harvey was not thinking about television. He was thinking about his own daughters, about every parent who had ever watched their child suffer, about the miracle of small victories that cost everything. He stood directly in front of Michaela. "Did you just—" He couldn't finish the sentence. His voice broke. Steve Harvey, comedian, host, performer, broke on live television. Michaela nodded. Her eyes were bright with tears. Her hands trembled. But she opened her mouth again, and this time the word came stronger. "Start. Over." Her answer. To the question. Name something people say they'll do tomorrow but never actually do. Start over. It was perfect. It was poetic. It was the most profound answer that had ever been given on Family Feud, because it wasn't just about surveys and points, it was about her, about what she had been trying to do for 6 months, about what she was doing right now. Steve's hand covered his heart. "Oh my God," he whispered. Then louder. "Oh my God." He turned to the audience. "Did y'all hear that? Did you hear what just happened?" The audience erupted, but it wasn't applause exactly. It was something more primal, sobs and cheers and gasps all tangled together. Strangers grabbed each other's hands. Grown men wiped their eyes. Women openly wept. The camera operators, who had seen everything over years of working television, struggled to keep their shots steady. Steve looked back at Michaela. "How long has it been since you spoke?" Michaela held up 2 fingers. 2 years. 2 years, Steve repeated, his voice thick. "And you chose right now, here, with all these cameras, with your family watching, with all of America watching." He shook his head in wonder. "Why?" Michaela's hands moved, and Linda translated, her voice breaking. "Because they gave me everything. I wanted to give them something back." That's when Jennifer Cooper broke from the family podium. Protocol be damned. Producers be damned. She actually ran across the stage and grabbed her daughter, pulling her close, both of them shaking with sobs that transcended sound. David was right behind her, wrapping his arms around both of them. The twins followed, creating a circle of family, of love, of unity so profound that the studio felt too small to contain it. Steve Harvey stepped back, giving them space, giving them this moment. Tears ran freely down his face. His suit jacket was wrinkled where he kept wiping his eyes. His carefully maintained television persona was completely gone, stripped away to reveal just a man, a father witnessing grace. The audience stood, not because anyone told them to, not because a sign flashed or a director signaled. They stood because some moments demand it, because witnessing courage requires you to rise, because 300 people understood that they were not at a game show anymore. They were in a sanctuary. The cameras kept rolling, but no one was thinking about content anymore. No one was thinking about ratings or runtime, or whether this would make the broadcast edit. The crew, the producers, the network executives watching from monitors backstage, everyone understood that what they were capturing was something that transcended television. This was documentation of the human spirit. This was proof that love can rewrite what trauma has written. Steve Harvey stood there, 10 feet away from the Cooper family, giving them space but unable to look away. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths, the kind you take when you're trying to hold yourself together and failing beautifully. Makeup would have to fix his face later. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet. He didn't care. Some things matter more than appearance. After what felt like forever, and no time at all, the Cooper family slowly separated. Jennifer kept one hand on Michaela's face, her thumb tracing her daughter's cheekbone like she needed to confirm she was real. David had his arm around both of them. The twins stood close, their usual energy replaced with something quieter, something that looked like reverence. Steve walked back toward them, moving slowly, like approaching something sacred. He stopped a few feet away and just shook his head. "Michaela," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. "I need you to know something." He paused, gathering himself. "I've been doing this for a long time, a long time. I've met presidents and movie stars and athletes and heroes. But what you just did," his voice cracked, "that's the bravest thing I've ever seen." Linda signed his words, her hands still trembling slightly. Michaela watched, her eyes never leaving Steve's face, reading his expression even more than the signs. Steve continued, "You could have stayed quiet. You could have let your interpreter speak. You had every reason to stay in your comfort zone, but you didn't. You chose courage over comfort. You chose to try." He wiped his face with both hands. "And you know what? Even if the words hadn't come out perfect, even if they hadn't come out at all, you would still be brave. You understand me? The trying is the thing. The courage is the thing." Michaela nodded, and then, because courage builds on courage, because trying once makes trying again a little easier, she opened her mouth and spoke again. "Thank." 2 words, barely above a whisper, but they landed like thunder. Steve closed his eyes, his face tilting upward like he was trying to compose himself and failing. "Oh, Lord," he muttered. "Y'all trying to kill me today." The audience laughed through their tears, grateful for the release, for permission to feel joy alongside the heartbreak. He looked at David and Jennifer. "And you two, you parents." His voice took on a different tone, still emotional, but edged with something that felt like conviction. "Do you understand what you did? Do you understand the gift you gave your daughter?" David tried to speak but couldn't. He just shook his head, overcome. Steve spoke for him. You didn't just learn sign language. Lots of people do that. You entered her world completely. You made sure she was never alone in her silence. You showed her that family means showing up, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how much it costs you. He pointed at them. That's ministry. That's what love looks like, when it has no choice but to be bigger than itself. Jennifer finally found her voice. She's our daughter, she said simply, as if that explained everything. And maybe it did. Steve turned to the twins, Marcus and Ethan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet. And you two knuckleheads! The boys grinned despite their tears. You learned a whole language for your sister. You know how many kids your age can barely learn Spanish in school? You learned ASL because you love her. That makes you pretty special too. Marcus signed something quickly, and Linda translated, She's worth it. Yeah, she is, Steve agreed. Yeah, she is. He turned back to Michaela. For a moment, he just looked at her. This 16-year-old girl who had lost so much and fought so hard to reclaim pieces of herself. Can I ask you something? He said gently. Michaela nodded. Why didn't you tell your family you were learning to speak again? The question hung in the air. Michaela's hands moved slowly, thoughtfully, and Linda's voice carried the weight of her words. I was scared. Scared it wouldn't work. Scared they would hope too much. Scared I would disappoint them. Jennifer made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Disappoint us? Baby, you could never. But Michaela wasn't finished. Her hands kept moving. They gave up so much for me, changed their whole lives. I didn't want them to think I was ungrateful. That learning to speak again meant their signing wasn't enough. The studio felt the weight of that confession. The complexity of love. The way gratitude and fear can exist in the same heart. The way we sometimes hide our struggles from the people who love us most, not because we don't trust them, but because we trust them too much, because their pain hurts worse than our own. Steve Harvey, who had started this day as a game show host, found himself in the role of counselor, pastor, father. Listen to me, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Your family didn't learn ASL because they thought you were broken. They learned it because they love you. And you learning to speak again? He gestured to all of them. That doesn't diminish what they did. It honors it. It says, you loved me enough that I felt brave enough to try the impossible. You hear me? Michaela nodded, tears streaming down her face. And let me tell you something else. Steve looked around the studio, at the 300 people who had become witnesses instead of spectators. Every person in this room just learned something today. We learned that disability doesn't mean inability. We learned that family isn't about blood, it's about showing up. We learned that courage doesn't roar. Sometimes courage is a 16-year-old girl whispering 2 words after 2 years of silence. The applause that followed wasn't the kind they had rehearsed. It wasn't on cue. It started slow, building like a wave, until the entire studio was on its feet again, clapping not for entertainment but for truth, for witnessing something real in a world that often feels scripted. Steve let it wash over them, over all of them. Then he did something that would become part of Family Feud legend. He walked to the production table, grabbed a piece of paper, and wrote something down. He folded it and handed it to David Cooper. That's my personal number, he said quietly, but his mic caught it anyway. Y'all need anything? Anything at all, you call me. I mean it. David's hand shook as he took the paper. Steve, we can't. Yes, you can. And you will. Steve's voice left no room for argument. This family right here? Y'all are special. And I want to know how Michaela's doing. I want to know when she speaks her first full sentence. I want to know when she graduates. You understand me? This ain't just television anymore. This is family. And somehow, impossibly, he meant it. The episode aired 6 weeks later on a Thursday evening in November. The producers had debated how to edit it. How do you cut courage down to fit a television slot? How do you trim grace to make room for commercials? In the end, they didn't. They gave the Cooper family segment nearly the entire episode, letting the moment breathe, letting silence speak, trusting that America would understand what they were witnessing. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the clip had been viewed millions of times online. Comments poured in from every corner of the world. Deaf communities shared it with pride and recognition. Parents of disabled children watched it and wept. Teachers played it in classrooms. Therapists sent it to clients who had stopped believing in their own resilience. It wasn't viral in the way funny cat videos go viral. It was viral in the way truth spreads, because it touched something fundamental about what it means to be human. Steve Harvey's phone, the personal number he had given the Coopers, rang that night. David Cooper's voice was shaking. "Steve, we don't know how to thank you." "You don't thank me," Steve had replied. "You just keep being who you are. You keep showing the world what family looks like." But the story didn't end there. Stories like this never do. 3 months after the episode aired, Michaela gave her first public speech at a disability awareness conference in Denver. Her voice was stronger now, more confident, though still bearing the unique cadence of someone navigating sound without hearing it. She spoke for 7 minutes about courage, family, and the bridges we build to reach each other across silence. The audience, therapists, educators, advocates gave her a standing ovation that lasted so long she had to sit down, overwhelmed. Her mother, signing from the front row, told her, "We're so proud of you." And Michaela, using both voice and hands, replied, "I know." The Cooper family started a foundation 6 months later. Voices United provided free ASL classes to families of newly deaf children, offered therapy scholarships, and created support networks for parents navigating the overwhelming landscape of childhood hearing loss. The first donation came from Steve Harvey himself, a check large enough to fund their first year of operations. He didn't announce it, didn't publicize it, just sent it with a note. "Keep changing the world." Letters arrived at the Family Feud offices for months afterward. A father in Ohio wrote that watching Michaela speak had given him courage to learn sign language for his deaf son, something he'd been too intimidated to try for 3 years. A teenager in Florida who had stopped speaking after trauma wrote that seeing Michaela's bravery helped her find her voice again, too. A teacher in Texas incorporated the episode into her lesson plan on resilience, and her students raised money to buy ASL dictionaries for their school library. Steve Harvey, in interviews afterward, would become emotional every time someone mentioned the Coopers. "I've interviewed celebrities, billionaires, people the world calls successful," he said on one talk show, his voice thick. "But that family, that 16-year-old girl, that's real success. That's what matters. Not fame, not money, but showing up for each other, fighting for each other, loving each other enough to learn a new language literally and figuratively. The family still signs at home. That hasn't changed. Michaela's speaking continues to improve, but ASL remains their primary language, the foundation they built together. Because the point was never about choosing sound over silence. It was about building bridges. It was about creating a family language that included everyone, that excluded no one, that made room for both voice and hands. On the anniversary of the episode's airing, the Coopers posted a video, all 5 of them together, signing and speaking simultaneously, thanking the world for the support. Michaela's voice was clear and strong, her hands moving in perfect synchronization. "A year ago, I was terrified," she said. "Today, I'm grateful. Not because I can speak again, but because I learned that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about trying, even when you're terrified. It's about letting people love you. It's about showing up for yourself the way your family shows up for you." The video ended with all 5 Coopers signing the same phrase. Family is not about perfection. It's about presence. Steve Harvey shared it on his social media with 3 words. "This is church." And maybe it was. Maybe that's what happened that Tuesday afternoon in September on stage 43. Not television, not entertainment, but something closer to testimony. A moment when the ordinary became sacred. When a game show became a sanctuary. When courage wore a 16-year-old's face and spoke 2 words after 2 years, and the world stopped to listen. Because sometimes television doesn't just entertain, it heals. Sometimes a moment of bravery becomes a movement of hope. Sometimes one girl's voice reminds millions of us that we are stronger than we know, braver than we believe, and more loved than we can imagine. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, we realize that the most powerful stories aren't the ones that make us laugh. They're the ones that make us remember what it means to be human. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.